Undir yfirskriftinni Látum vísindin tala fór fram fyrirlestararöð 6 sérfræðinga frá öllum heimshornum á Íslandi í Reykjavík þann 4. október 2023. Samtökin Frelsi og ábyrgð stóðu fyrir málþinginu. Eftirfarandi spurningum er svarað ítarlega í þessari fyrirlestraröð. Af hverju eru alvarlegar aukaverkanir svona tíðar? Standast COVID-sprautur öryggiskröfur? Eru sumar lotur bóluefna skaðlegri en aðrar? Verður yfirstjórn valds í heilbrigðismálum framselt umræðulaust til hú? Fyrirlesarar voru Pierre Corey, læknir og vísindamaður frá Bandaríkjunum sem hefur mikið fjallað rannsóknir á Ivermectin, lyfi sem notaði til fyrirbyggjandi meðferðar á COVID-19. Sasha Latipova, fyrrum stjórnandi í lyfjaiðnaðinum frá Úkraínu, fjallar hvernig heilsugæslan hefur verið vígvædd. Katherine, löglærður rannsóknarblaðamaður frá Bandaríkjunum, fjallar hvernig lagarammi hefur verið aðlagaður að ríkisstyrktum lífefnahernaði. Dr. Vibke Manniche og Max Schmeling frá Danmörku flytja fyrirlestur rannsóknarniðurstöður sínar á mismunandi COVID-19 lotum. Philip Kruse, lögmaður frá Sviss, fjallar framsal valds í heilbrigðismálum til WHO sem muni ganga í garð 1. desember sé ekkert aðhafst. Kæru áhorfendur, KLA-TV býður ykkur upp á þessa verðmætu umræðu í uppgjöri á hinum svokallaða kórónufaraldri. Sasha Katherine Watt. Watt er löglærður rannsóknarblaðamaður frá Bandaríkjunum. Hún hefur starfað við lögfræðirannsóknir fyrir lögfræðistofur á sviði stjórnskipunar, borgararéttinda og umhverfisréttar. Síðustu ár hefur hún skrifað talsvert spillingu fyrirtækja og stjórnvalda og ekki síst málefni matvæla, vatns og orkuöryggis. Frá árinu 2020 hefur Watt rannsakað breytingar á bandarískum lögum sem kom í veg fyrir saksókn vegna lífeðlisfræðilegra glæpa á tímum COVID. Katherine Watt, morð af ásetningi, lagarammar fyrir ríkisstyrktan lífefnahernað.
So, I'm a writer and I'm a paralegal, and I got involved in these things starting from a background. I was raised as a traditional Roman Catholic, and that's relevant to the work that I've done since, because prior to Vatican II in the 1960s, the Catholic Church had very clear teachings about the difference between truth and error, the nature of man, his final ends, and relations between man and society. And because I was raised in that traditional Catholic upbringing, that was kind of the stuff that was going on in my house. I drifted away from my Catholic faith as a teenager, and then I came back to it during COVID, because as it dawned on me how evil the big picture was, it also dawned on me that for that coordinated of an evil to be getting so far, there must be something even more good against which it was fighting. And that brought me back into the faith. But in my young adult, I went to Penn State. I studied philosophy and natural sciences. I worked as a reporter after that for small newspapers. And then I got a paralegal certificate. And a paralegal, I understand you don't have those in Iceland, but in the United States, a paralegal is a legal assistant who works for lawyers, but the things they can't do are sign documents and appear in court on behalf of people, but pretty much they can do everything else. We learn how to do legal research, we learn how to do legal writing, we learn how to look at the facts of the case when the client brings them in and apply the law that we have researched to the facts of that case. So when COVID began in the beginning of 2020, that was the skill set with which I had to try to understand what was happening. And I'm here because Sasha located my work. I was writing on my website, which is Bailiwick News on Substack, and also during my adult life I started several blogs, and I did investigative reporting on other issues that turned out to be related, primarily one called preemption doctrine, which is an American legal principle where higher levels of government can supersede each lower level. And I learned about it in the context of concentrated agricultural feed operations. They're called CAFOs in the United States. It's when a company, any corporation, wants to come into a community and do something that the local community thinks will be bad for them, or bad for their water, or bad for their air. The local communities would try to pass laws at the local level to stop it, and they would quickly find out that the state could preempt that and tell them, no, you have to accept this thing that you do not want and it's dangerous for your population. So that was what I had been doing for 15 years at the end of 2019. So I was looking at, I live in Pennsylvania in the United States, and I was watching the lockdowns and the mask mandates, and I had familiarity with constitutional law and civil rights law and a little bit with criminal law, and I couldn't figure out why the cases that were being brought by businesses, especially, who were saying why they were suing the state government, particularly the governor, to say, we have a right to our property, we have a right to our business to be open, you can't come in with these executive orders and just shut things down. And the governor said, yes, I can. And the one case that was most powerful was one called Butler versus Yates, because it was business owners plus a county government suing the governor, or Butler versus Wolf is our governor at the time. And the federal judge got the case in May of 2020, and in September of 2020 issued a really good ruling that said, these business owners are correct. There may be an emergency, but the Constitution is designed to be strong enough to withstand emergencies and still protect individual liberties. And 3 weeks later, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the next level up, put a hold on that federal decision and allowed the executive orders that were shutting down businesses and closing schools and all that to stand. And it was that pattern that I saw over and over again, where a case would come up and then something would come out, I couldn't tell where it was coming from the side, and knock it out before it could do the constitutional function that the courts are meant to do. I have since found out, like just in the last few weeks, a reader referred me to the work of Nikki Rapana and Nordica Friedrich on something called communitarian law. And that is one of the names for this like blanket of other globally driven law that comes into countries and smothers their constitutional law, their criminal codes, everything else under these kinds of circumstances, like what Sasha was talking about with the public health emergency, which is how I tracked it through in 2021 and 2022. And all of these findings can be replicated. You can go to the legal system, and the main post that I did about it is called the American Domestic Bioterrorism Program. That's the one, it's a timeline of the laws that are specific to the United States, but the exact same thing is in place in these countries all around the world because it's driven from higher than the nation state level. So, as I was saying, I was watching these cases, I was really confused. 2021, got to the beginning of 2022, and I heard a podcast by an attorney, American attorney Todd Callender, in January of 2022, and he talked about the World Health Organization's International Health Regulations 2005 amendments as being the thing that tied these things together, that comes in from outside of a nation state and supersedes or sort of manipulates its law. And so I did a first report at the end of February in 2022 called Legal Walls of the COVID-19 Kill Box. And that report was more on the global level, the bigger picture. And then I kept digging into the specific American laws that implement the IHR 2005 amendments. And I know you all know that they're going through another round of revisions right now. And James Roguski is reporting on it, and Meryl Nass is reporting on it, and lots of people are reporting on it. The 2005 ones are the ones that I did the most research on because that's what was in place already at the time that COVID hit. What I found was that things seem to have gotten really underway in 1944 with the congressional passage of the Public Health Service Act, which established a new branch of the military that was the Public Health Service. And from that foundation, all of these other things got added on to each other, sort of like Legos. If you put the bricks on brick by brick by brick, and then you end up with this wall that sort of surrounds us now. Another key turning point was the 1983 Public Health Emergencies Program, which was added again by an act of Congress, and Sasha mentioned that too. And then there's hundreds of pages of these laws. They are in lots and lots of different titles, which is sections of U.S. law, like they're in the Homeland Security section, they're in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act section, and they interweave with each other, and Sasha was talking about that too. The especially bad ones that really put the last pieces into place were the Project BioShield Act in 2004 and the PrEP Act in 2005. And the way that the international health regulations work is that it's not a treaty, it's called a legally binding instrument of international law. So it's like a treaty. And once it is passed through these insane procedures that the World Health Assembly does with negotiators that are, this is more that Jim Roguski covers. By default, if the World Health Assembly representatives pass something at their annual meeting in May, according to the law of the World Health Organization and the IHR, those things automatically go into effect 18 months later, unless the political body of the member state explicitly rejects those amendments and says we are not going to accept them. And that's what's going on right now. There were a set of amendments adopted by the World Health Assembly in May 2022, which will automatically go into effect in December 2023 unless the legislatures and executives of the member states reject them, and none of them appear to be interested in doing that at this time, but they should. And so, lost my train of thought a little bit. The overall point is that it forces member states to adopt implementing legislation because they're a member state, because they've signed this treaty. And that's what happened. Like, all of the laws that are in place in the United States were done to comply with this. And it's ongoing. Like, every few months they add more. So my core findings were that public health emergencies are pretext for power consolidation and legalized mass murder, using state-sponsored biochemical warfare and weapons camouflaged as vaccines and countermeasures. This is what Sasha was talking about too. But I also think that a secondary goal, almost as important, if not more important, is that they want to orchestrate constitutional crises worldwide, because that will help them consolidate more power with the globalist organizations. If they can get people really angry with their own governments, they can get people interested in, well, maybe the technocrats at the UN are going to do a better job. So that makes it very tricky for navigating through those two things, because the governments are not doing what they're supposed to do to protect their populations. But it's even worse if those governments collapse and the UN moves in. The global mechanisms are treaties and treaty-like international instruments, and then the domestic mechanisms are statutes, regulations, executive orders, contracts, scientific research and development guidance, legal interpretation documents, and it's mirrored at all levels. So it's not just like the national government has to do these things. The national government does it, and then they go down and get, for example, in the United States, all of the states have their own mini versions of these laws about quarantine, about surveillance, about treatments,
the congressional passage of the Public Health
about
Service
manufacturing.
Act, which
and it's also mirrored in all of the different countries.
The public health service.
So COVID-19 is the fullest demonstration of this system. It's been in place for a while, and pieces of it were used previously, like with H1N1 and SARS-1 in 2003, but COVID is the first time they sort of put all the pieces together and slammed it all down at once. The Project BioShield Act, as I said, was passed by Congress in 2004. It made amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, which is in our code at 21 USC 360 BBB, and it governs, as Sasha was talking about, regulation-exempt development, manufacturing, distribution, and use of countermeasures during declared emergencies. It essentially legalizes public-private partnerships to make and use biochemical weapons, and the core provision is 21 USC 360 BBB-3K, which says if a product is the subject of an authorization at the sole discretion of the Health and Human Services Secretary, under this section, the use of it shall not be considered to constitute a clinical investigation. And that was the thing that was corroborated by Pfizer's motion to dismiss in Brooks-Jackson's False Claims Act. And then it was corroborated further because the US government, which should have been on her side in prosecuting Pfizer for fraud, refused to prosecute it, left her to prosecute it by herself, and then came back into the case in October 2022 to say, yes, we agree with Pfizer. They were never obligated to do any of these things related to proper clinical trials or regulation because it wasn't a clinical trial. It was a demonstration, and the implication is it was a bioweapon, it was a countermeasure, it was a military product for military purposes. And then the PrEP Act is the liability exemption license to kill. That's codified at 42 USC 247D, and essentially consolidates ruling power in the Health and Human Services Secretary's hands to declare, maintain, and wield unchecked authority during a public health emergency. And it's very specific. It has sections that say, once a Health and Human Services Secretary has made this declaration, there can be no judicial review of the facts or the law or anything to do with declaring it or maintaining it. And there can also not be any congressional oversight of it. And the states and localities and tribes, like these lower down things, can't do anything different from what the HHS secretary is telling them to do. So it legalizes the administrative cabinet secretaries and their staffs to operate this mass murder program camouflaged as a public health program, and they can delegate the license to kill down to the lower levels, which is the county health departments and the pharmacies and whoever else they need to, with no criminal or civil liability. And the core provision here is 42 USC. Well, I won't say it, but it says no matter what any other law says, a person who acts on this Health and Human Services Authority and follows these orders cannot be prosecuted criminally or civilly. They have immunity, which is essentially the just following orders defense from the Nuremberg Code, but it's made into being completely legal. So the conclusion I reached after I had looked at these laws and I looked at what was happening with what Jessica Rose and all the people, Sasha, everybody that was looking at the VAERS data, that these are intentional acts of war camouflaged as public health programs and medical countermeasures. And this was supported by the evidence from people like John O'Looney, Mike Eden, Brooke Jackson's case, and even also on the financial side with Katherine Austin Fitz and John Titus. Are you there? Because I'm supposed to be done now.
Sorry.
Yeah, am I supposed to be done now?
No.
No. Oh, okay.
Take it easy.
Okay.
Take a deep breath.
Okay. So what it looks like to me, and what I write about at my website, is that it's a covert global civil war, and most people don't even know that they're in this war yet. But the three priorities for the people who do know, who have initiated it, are they want to be perceived as legitimate. They want people to think that the concentration of power makes sense because there's this big emergency, and they need to rely on the central government because the central government knows what to do. And they also, at the same time, need people to think that their own governments are incompetent. And that's what I was kind of talking about before, because this whole thing, in my view, is setting up the conditions for people to abandon their own countries, their loyalties to their own country, their sense of their own people, and the legitimacy of their own political unit, to turn it over to the United Nations and the World Economic Forum and Gates and whoever else. They also need speed because they're trying to reduce world population, especially in North America and Western Europe. Apparently to meet a deadline in 2030. And at the same time, they need plausible deniability. They need people not to know what's happening and not to figure it out, not to stop taking the boosters, not to stop fighting, yes, we want them to stop fighting against what they're doing. And sometimes those priorities are in conflict. So they were trying to go gradually with the legal changes and gradually with vaccines. And I don't think Sasha talked about this, but I did vaccinate my kids. I was vaccinated myself. I now regret those enormously because now I can see that they were doing it for longer with lower dose toxins that were less obvious than what these ones did. But that wasn't going fast enough, so they pulled the whole COVID program and made it happen. And because they did it so fast and so hard and so coordinated, it woke a lot of people up, and that's where we're at now, because they were trying to balance these plausible deniability and speed and went too fast and too hard. So I get a lot of different responses to this. The first one is usually this makes sense of things that are not well explained just by regulatory capture, just by big pharma profiteering, just by the regulators not being competent. And then the second response I get is, what the hell? How can this be happening? How can governments be doing this on purpose? How can the regulators be playing along? How can the counties be playing along and the states and it not be stopped? And so I have had to come up with some provisional answers. I think it has to do with financial and debt reduction. They want fewer people getting health care. They want fewer people getting pensions. They want longevity to go down. And this is the same analysis that Katherine Austin Fitz talks about a lot. Some people talk about the AI robotics. There's a surplus population because they don't need the workers anymore that may have been useful in the past. And the other one is just the pure evil part of this desire to control and enslave people just because they want to do that. Then people ask me to speculate about who, and I think it's the private owners of the Bank for International Settlements and the national central banks, because they are the ones who have the leverage over the national governments to say, do this, or we will cut you off from all of your international financial transactions. And they demonstrate that. They demonstrated it with Cyprus and Greece and the Vatican in 2012, 2013. So the other ones know, they really can do it. And the other thing I've found is that emotionally processing it is much, much more difficult than just understanding the facts and the mechanics of it. So the biggest, most often question is, what do we do? And the first thing, I say this, Sasha says this, is enjoy your life as much as you can, as fully as you can, in the way that human beings do, like loving and spending time with your family and friends, doing good work, praying, because one of the things that's really important to them is to just make people disconnect from being human and disconnect from each other and the higher God. And So the second thing is to defy all the orders to hurt yourself. Don't do it. Don't take any more. If you've taken some of the shots, don't get your kids vaccinated or bioweaponed, and help others do it, because other people may want to do it, but they may not feel like they can because they're isolated and they don't know all the things. So if you can help people you know, say, yes, it's right, you should defy these orders, you should not take these things. The third thing is to understand it takes time, and speak up about it. Specifically on the legal side, Brooke Jackson's case was excellent because she really believed at the beginning that fraud was a crime that should be punished and that the law is criminalized. And what she found, or what her case revealed, is that that is not the case. Some people are allowed to do fraud and not get prosecuted. So filing more cases that are better designed to draw out those similar kinds of responses would be very good. And then the other ones are pushing lawmakers and courts to kind of throw off this smothering blanket of the communitarian law and reassert constitutional rule of law by, what they have to do is certainly repeal things like the Project BioShield Act and the PrEP Act, because if they don't repeal that, the power stays in the Health and Human Services Secretary's hands, because like I said before, courts can't nullify it, Congress can't override it, states can't override it, but Congress can repeal the law that Congress itself passed. They do need to build a majority to do that, but regular people can push for that. 5 minutes, okay. And then the other one is to push lawmakers all around the world to withdraw from these supranational treaties and conventions. This is the exit WHO, exit the EU, exit the Bank for International Settlements, exit the UN, all of them. I think this is a repeat, yes. The one other thing I wanted to mention is that I recently, in my research, because I've been looking more at EU stuff, and I have lists at my website of the EU regulations and directives and decisions that are similar to the ones in the United States, in the sense that once the EU Commission drafts it and the European Parliament rubber stamps it, it's automatically binding on the member states in the EU. And they have similar ones about genetically modified GMO pharmaceuticals and things like that. They have things about public health emergencies and things that trigger automatic financial contributions by the member states into the EU once the EU says there is this public health emergency situation, which they did with COVID. And that research has taken me into the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which was adopted in 1969 and then entered into force in 1980. And it has a provision for how you get out of treaties, which has to do with fundamental change of circumstance. So I think it's arguable that the public discovery that individuals who are pretending to represent legitimate governments are actually engaged in a mass murder campaign would count as a fundamental change of circumstance that would give the governments the moral right and the legal right to withdraw their countries from those treaties, including the International Health Regulations of 2005, the entire World Health Organization Constitution, which started in 1946. And so that's an area where I'm going to be doing more research and more writing. And then I'll close with a little bit more about the relevance of the Catholic teaching, because Pope Pius XII actually let's just say 1952, but he gave a speech on the moral limits of medical research and treatment just after the Nuremberg trials. And in that speech, he made the point that insofar as the moral justification of experiments rests on the mandate of the public authority, and therefore on the subordination of the individual to the community and of the individual's welfare to the common welfare, it's based on an erroneous explanation of this principle. It must be noted that in his personal being, in his own body, in his own life, man is not finally ordered to usefulness of society. On the contrary, the community exists for man. And that's the sort of distinction that we're dealing with now, because the totalitarians at the World Economic Forum and the Bank for International Settlement pervert the concept of the common good to say that individuals are subordinate to the common good and that you can do anything you want to an individual, up to and including killing them, if you can make a case or if you can get enough people to believe that that's good for the planet or it's good for the control of this coronavirus or whatever. So restoring the proper understanding of the purpose of society and how man fits with it is really important too. Thank you.